May 1945, Northern Germany. The war has been over for barely 2 weeks, yet the silence feels heavier than any bombardment. Behind a chain-link fence, rows of women sit on the damp earth. Nurses, secretaries, auxiliaries, widows in tattered Wehrmacht coats. Their uniforms are stripped of insignia, their eyes of certainty. The cold wind moves through the camp like an invisible ghost, carrying the faint clang of tin bowls and distant church bells, marking a peace no one can feel. A British guard, no older than 23, walks the perimeter. His boots crunch on gravel. His rifle hangs loosely at his side. When his gaze meets one of the women, pale, trembling, clutching a blanket too thin for the northern chill, he stops for a moment. Then, quietly, he says only 3 words. "You're beautiful." The woman doesn't move. Her lips part, but no sound escapes. For years, she'd been told the Allies were beasts, merciless conquerors who would destroy everything German. And now, one of them had spoken to her with kindness. No one in that camp slept easily that night. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation collapsing under the weight of its own ideology. The Reich that once stretched across Europe now lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash, railways torn apart, millions displaced. The thunder of artillery had fallen silent, but the silence it left behind carried the echo of surrender. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies as savage invaders, men without mercy, ready to humiliate and destroy every German they captured. To millions of women, those words had become gospel. Posters warned of the horrors waiting if the enemy entered Germany. Mothers whispered to their daughters, "It's better to die than be taken." So when Allied soldiers finally crossed the Elbe, they did not find resistance. They found fear. Thousands of German women, many who had worked for the Wehrmacht or in auxiliary roles, walked out of the forests with white rags tied to sticks, surrendering without a word. They expected brutality. Some even braced for death. But what they met instead, order, food, medical aid, felt like an illusion. The British and Americans established controlled internment zones for women suspected of aiding the Nazi war effort. These were not concentration camps. They were guarded, but humane, regulated under the Geneva Convention. Yet, to those who entered them, every sound of a rifle bolt or command in English felt like a prelude to something darker. The women waited, tense and hollow-eyed, for the cruelty they had been told would come. And when it didn't, when an Allied soldier offered water or shared a cigarette or smiled, confusion replaced fear. The world they thought they understood had ended, and a new one, built on contradictions, was just beginning to form inside those wire fences. The first women's prisoner of war camps under British supervision were established across northern Germany, in places like Eselheide, Fallingbostel, and Lübeck. Here, the British Army followed a simple principle: control through discipline, not vengeance. The women were processed systematically, names recorded, possessions inventoried, medical checks completed under strict but humane conditions. There were no beatings, no shouted interrogations. The guards, most of them young men from villages in England or Scotland, were instructed to treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. They were soldiers, not executioners. Still, the emotional gulf was immense. The prisoners were not combatants in the traditional sense. Many had served in clerical or communication roles for the Wehrmacht. Some had volunteered under Hitler youth programs. Others were simply wives of officers, swept along by circumstance. But in the eyes of the occupying powers, they all represented the defeated Reich. Conditions in the camps were stark but orderly. Wooden barracks, rationed food, daily roll calls. Many women arrived malnourished and ill. Red Cross nurses treated them side by side with German medical volunteers. Clean water, though scarce, was prioritized. Even the smallest act, a warm meal, a bar of soap, felt surreal to those who had expected punishment. Reports from British command described these women as bewildered and psychologically broken. They struggled to understand why they were treated decently. They fear reprisal, one officer wrote, yet they obey quickly and thank us for bread. Outside the fences, Germany itself was unrecognizable. Towns looted, homes occupied, the moral fabric of the nation unraveling. Inside, order was being rebuilt by the same men they had been taught to hate. It was within this fragile balance, between guilt, exhaustion, and a quiet yearning for dignity, that small, human gestures began to matter. A smile, a word of reassurance, or, one evening, a British guard's unexpected compliment that would ripple through the barracks like a whispered rumor. For the German women behind the barbed wire, captivity was not just a loss of freedom. It was the collapse of identity. They had lived for years under a regime that told them who they were. The mothers of the nation, the backbone of the fatherland, the silent support of soldiers. Nazi propaganda had elevated them to symbols, pure, obedient, untouchable. But that illusion crumbled when the Reich fell. Suddenly, they were no longer protectors of a glorious nation. They were simply prisoners, stripped of titles, medals, and certainty. Many had served in the Wehrmacht's auxiliary branches, communications clerks, nurses, or radio operators. They had sworn loyalty oaths to Adolf Hitler, some believing it was merely ceremony. Yet, in the aftermath of surrender, even that small act made them complicit in defeat. When the British trucks rolled into their villages, uniforms became a mark of shame. Inside the camps, silence became their refuge. They spoke little, avoided eye contact with guards, and clung to routine as if it could hold back reality. But the Allies' behavior, disciplined, calm, and unexpectedly humane, began to disturb that silence. One woman later recalled in her post-war diary, "We waited for humiliation, for revenge, but they only gave us food. They said, 'Please,' and 'Thank you.' We thought it was a trick." Another described how a British sergeant refused to enter their barracks without knocking first. It was a gesture so small, yet it shattered years of indoctrination. For the first time, they saw their captors as men, not monsters. Every act of kindness carried an unbearable weight. Gratitude felt dangerous, even shameful. Accepting compassion meant questioning everything they had been told about the enemy, and about themselves. At night, some cried quietly, unsure if it was from fear or relief. Others stared at the ceiling, whispering fragments of prayers. They did not yet understand that, for the Allies, mercy itself had become a form of victory, proof that moral strength could outlast ideology. And soon, that victory would become painfully personal, when a single human sentence, spoken without malice, forced them to confront the deepest wound of all, their own lost humanity. For the British Guards, the women inside those fences represented something entirely unfamiliar. They had trained for years to fight a ruthless enemy. Soldiers in gray, fanatics shouting, "Heil Hitler!" But what they found after victory were thin, frightened women who looked more like refugees than soldiers. Private James Carter, barely 20, had landed in Normandy the previous summer. He had seen friends die, towns burn, and villages flattened under artillery fire. Now, in May 1945, his orders were simple: guard the German prisoners, maintain discipline, no unnecessary contact. But standing watch over exhausted women, many no older than his sister, didn't feel like victory. It felt like something else, something heavier. The British command had made their stance clear. There would be no revenge. Unlike the Soviets, the Western Allies aimed to rebuild, not destroy. The war in Europe had ended in horror. Its aftermath, they hoped, would begin in restraint. Officers reminded their men daily that dignity was a weapon too, one that could win peace faster than bullets ever could. Even so, the emotional toll was real. Guards often struggled to reconcile what they'd been told with what they saw. Some prisoners still wore Nazi pins under their coats. Others broke down crying when asked simple questions. Hatred lingered in the air like smoke from burned-out towns. Carter once wrote in a letter home, "They're frightened of us, though we've done nothing." One thanked me for a cup of tea, as if I'd saved her life. That quiet, strained politeness became the strange rhythm of camp life. Orders were given softly. Interactions were brief. Yet every time a guard carried a sick woman to the infirmary or handed out extra rations from his own supply, something changed in both sides. The British were discovering a form of moral endurance, compassion in the shadow of genocide. And the women, trembling under blankets that once belonged to soldiers, were beginning to see that mercy could come even from those they feared most. Soon, one small exchange, an unplanned human moment, would collapse that wall of silence completely. And it would begin with a guard's voice, breaking the evening calm. It happened near dusk, the hour when the camp grew quiet, when the clatter of mess tins faded and the women gathered in small groups outside their barracks. The air smelled of wet soil and burned wood from nearby villages. Somewhere beyond the fence, a British soldier lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face before vanishing back into the gray twilight. Among the prisoners was a young woman, no longer in uniform, just a threadbare skirt and a coat 2 sizes too large. Her name, in the camp records, was Elizabeth Kay. She had been a communications aide at a Luftwaffe base near Bremen, captured 2 weeks after the surrender. Since arriving, she had spoken almost nothing. That evening, as she stood in line for food, one of the guards noticed her struggling to carry her bowl with bandaged hands. He stepped forward instinctively, took the bowl, and helped her fill it from the soup drum. She hesitated, frozen, uncertain if this was some kind of test. He said nothing at first, just handed the bowl back, careful not to touch her fingers. Then, after a moment of silence, he murmured quietly, "You're beautiful." The words were simple, almost accidental, but in that silence they struck with the force of a shell. Elizabeth stared at him, not with pride, not with embarrassment, but with disbelief. Beautiful! Her hair was matted, her face gaunt from weeks of hunger. She had spent years hearing that her worth was measured by obedience, purity, loyalty to the Führer. Now, her world reduced to a barbed wire cage, a stranger, an enemy, had spoken to her like she was still human. Around her, a few women had overheard. They exchanged brief, uneasy glances. No one spoke. The guard, realizing what he'd said, looked away and returned to his post without another word. But the moment had already spread. A compliment so ordinary in peacetime, so impossible in war, had broken through years of indoctrination. Inside that camp, the air felt different that night, and as darkness settled over the rows of barracks, quiet conversations began to stir. Women whispering, questioning everything they had once believed. That night, the barracks were unusually silent. The faint murmur of voices drifted between the bunks, carried by candlelight and exhaustion. No one mentioned the guard by name, but everyone knew what had happened. The words, "You're beautiful," passed from mouth to mouth, whispered in disbelief. For some, it was almost frightening. For others, it was unbearable. They had been trained to see the enemy as something inhuman, cold, mechanical, pitiless. Yet here was proof, undeniable and disorienting, that the enemy could feel kindness. Elizabeth lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling boards above her. Each creak of the wood reminded her of the long nights in air raid shelters, the sermons about loyalty, the speeches that promised glory or death. But none of those voices had ever said she was beautiful. None had spoken with such gentleness. Outside, the guard's shadow passed by the window. For a fleeting second she thought of standing up, of saying something back. Maybe a thank you, maybe nothing at all. But the words stayed locked behind her teeth. For the first time she began to feel the full weight of the deception she had lived under. The Reich had promised honor, purity, and strength. But what she now felt, this strange ache of being seen, was something it had never offered: humanity. In another corner of the barracks, two older women sat whispering. "He said it kindly," one murmured. The other nodded, eyes glistening. "I didn't know they could." The phrase carried through the room like a fragile truth, one no one dared to speak aloud in daylight. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering softly on the tin roof. The sound mixed with quiet sobs that no one tried to hide. Some wept for shame, others for relief. By morning, the world outside the fence would be the same. Gray skies, watchtowers, and soldiers standing guard. But inside the minds of those women, something irreversible had changed. The war had not only ended in defeat, it had ended with revelation. They had met compassion where they expected cruelty, and that realization would haunt them far longer than any battle ever could. In the weeks that followed, the British camps settled into a quiet rhythm, orderly, restrained, almost mechanical. Yet beneath that order, something fragile was growing. The incident with the compliment was never written in any report. No officer mentioned it, no logbook recorded it. But among the prisoners, it lived on, not as gossip, but as a story they couldn't forget. For many, it marked the first time they began to question the narratives they had been fed for years. British officers noticed subtle changes. The women who once refused to speak now began asking questions about the outside world, about food rations, about the reconstruction of Germany. Some volunteered for camp duties, helping distribute supplies, or teach others English phrases. There was still mistrust, but it was no longer total. The guard who had spoken those words continued his rounds as before, disciplined, expressionless, yet his behavior, calm, patient, quietly respectful, began to set a tone. Others followed his example. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of morality, just consistency, humanity, shown in small fragments. The Red Cross later described the British-run camps as models of restraint, The women received mail, medical care, and even religious services. When one of them fell ill, a guard stayed by her bedside until she recovered. For the prisoners, these gestures were almost unbearable. Kindness felt like confrontation. Accepting it meant facing what their own regime had done to others. In post-war interviews, many former inmates recalled that strange period as the first time they saw themselves clearly. "We had lived in fear of monsters," one woman wrote, "but the monsters were gone. In their place were men, tired, polite, and merciful. It broke us." By late summer, repatriation began. Most were released to their hometowns, carrying only their papers and a few Red Cross parcels. But the memory of that camp, of decency in defeat, stayed with them. The war had stripped them of everything but survival. Kindness, unexpectedly, gave them back something even rarer: the chance to feel human again. And for the victors, it became proof that compassion could achieve what conquest never could: the quiet dismantling of hate. When the women finally left the camps, the roads of northern Germany were still lined with ruins. Burned-out vehicles, collapsed bridges, and the hollow shells of homes stood as reminders that the war had not just destroyed armies, it had dismantled entire lives. Yet amid that destruction, a peculiar kind of rebuilding had begun, not of cities, but of conscience. Many of the women who had passed through the British camps would later speak about those weeks as a turning point. They could not explain why, but something in them had shifted. For some, it began with that single moment, a compliment given without reason, by a man who owed them nothing. Others remembered the calm discipline of their guards, the quiet refusal to humiliate the defeated. In those small gestures, they began to see a version of Germany's future that the Reich had denied them. One where dignity was not granted by race or power, but by simple humanity. Historians later referred to this as the moral reconstruction of post-war Germany, a slow, invisible process that began not in speeches or tribunals, but in interactions like these. The British approach to occupation was deliberate. Punish the guilty, but protect the innocent. Rebuild moral order through fairness, not fear. It worked. Surveys conducted by Allied authorities in late 1946 showed that in the British zone, trust in foreign soldiers was significantly higher than in other parts of occupied Germany. Former prisoners often described their captors as strict but just. For many of the women, that justice became the first glimpse of a world no longer governed by ideology. Some became nurses or translators in the new Allied administration. A few even married former guards, not out of romance born in captivity, but out of shared respect that survived after it. The guards' words, "You're beautiful," were never written down, but they echoed far beyond the fence where they were spoken. In the ashes of a defeated empire, those three words carried an unexpected message: that compassion, even when spoken to the defeated, could begin to heal the victors as well. History often remembers wars by their battles, the noise, the fire, the numbers. But the true measure of a war's end lies in the silences that follow it. The silence of a woman hearing kindness from the enemy for the first time. The silence of a soldier realizing he no longer needs to hate to win. The story of that British guard and the German prisoner is not grand or heroic. It's small, almost invisible, a fragment lost among the ruins of a continent. Yet, it holds within it the essence of what peace truly means. Empires fall through pride. Nations rebuild through mercy. And in May 1945, when the world was raw with grief and vengeance, a few quiet men chose restraint over revenge. That choice, repeated thousands of times in forgotten camps and checkpoints, became the moral foundation upon which Europe rebuilt itself. For the German women who had been taught that defeat meant dishonor, those moments of unexpected compassion forced a reckoning far deeper than punishment ever could. They saw that dignity could survive even in surrender, and that humanity, denied for so long, could still be found in the eyes of an enemy. The words, "You're beautiful," were never about appearance. They were a declaration that even in the wreckage of ideology, human worth remained untouched. Years later, when those women spoke of their captivity, they rarely mentioned cruelty. They spoke of confusion, of gratitude, of the unbearable realization that the enemy had treated them as equals when their own leaders had not. That is the quiet legacy of that forgotten evening. In a war that dehumanized millions, one soldier's small act reminded the defeated that they were still human, and reminded the victors that mercy is its own kind of strength. History will always recall the battles, but the world that followed was rebuilt not by weapons nor treaties, but by simple words spoken through wire. "You're beautiful."